The gavel cracked against mahogany, punctuating Judge Whitmore's condescending chuckle. "Do you even understand what happens in a courtroom, young lady, or should I explain this in simpler terms?" he asked, peering over his glasses with theatrical concern. The gallery shifted uncomfortably as Aaliyah lifted her chin, her expression serene, almost grateful, as if he'd just handed her exactly what she needed. Aaliyah was used to being invisible, but today invisibility was a tactical advantage. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a stage set by Judge Harold Whitmore, a man whose impartial record was carefully maintained by never questioning his own assumptions. While the courtroom expected a frightened teenager seeking leniency, Aaliyah sat with a folder of case law that would turn Whitmore's bench into an exhibit of systemic failure. She'd spent 17 years watching people like him decide her future without seeing her at all. Today, she would make certain he couldn't look away. The Superior Court building didn't just occupy space, it consumed it. Aaliyah Monroe pushed through the brass-handled doors and felt the architecture swallow her whole. Marble columns rose like ancient sentinels, their surfaces cold and indifferent, stretching toward vaulted ceilings that seemed designed to make humans feel appropriately small. Her sneakers, the only pair without holes, squeaked against polished floors that probably cost more than her mother's annual salary. She was 17 years old, 5'3" in thick socks, and carrying a canvas tote bag that had seen better days. The building was designed to intimidate, and it was working. Security warned her twice. The metal detector beeped at her belt buckle, and the guard, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, whispered, "Courtroom 4B, honey. 3rd floor. You'll be all right." Aaliyah wasn't sure if the reassurance was protocol or pity, but she nodded anyway. The elevator climbed with agonizing slowness, and when the doors finally opened, she stepped into a corridor lined with wooden benches where other defendants sat slumped in resignation. Some stared at their phones. Others stared at nothing. All of them looked like they'd already lost. Courtroom 4B announced itself with a placard mounted on double doors, "The Honorable Harold Whitmore presiding." Aaliyah tested the weight of the brass handle before pulling it open. Inside, the room stretched impossibly wide. The judge's bench sat elevated on a platform, a throne of dark mahogany flanked by the American flag and the state seal. Behind it, wood paneling climbed the walls in geometric precision, each line a reminder of order, tradition, and immovable authority. The gallery seating felt vast and empty, even with a dozen people scattered across the pews. Aaliyah walked down the center aisle, her footsteps muffled by commercial carpet. She could feel eyes on her, the bailiff by the side door, the court reporter adjusting her stenotype, the prosecutor in his crisp suit organizing manila folders with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. At the defense table sat Michael Reyes, her public defender. He looked up from his notes, gave her a tired smile, and gestured to the chair beside him. She sat, placing her tote bag carefully at her feet. The room smelled like old books and floor polish, with an undertone of institutional coffee. Above, fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous tune. Everything about this space was designed to communicate a single message: you are not in control here. Aaliyah adjusted the collar of her borrowed blazer and folded her hands on the table. She'd been preparing for this moment longer than anyone in this room could possibly know. A door behind the bench opened with a decisive click. The bailiff stood. "All rise." The weight of the gavel was coming. Judge Harold Whitmore entered like a man accustomed to reverence. His robe billowed slightly as he climbed the steps to his bench, and when he settled into his leather chair, he did so with the satisfied sigh of someone returning to his natural habitat. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired and sharp-featured, with the kind of face that looked perpetually disappointed in whatever stood before it. "Be seated," he said, waving a dismissive hand. The courtroom obeyed. Whitmore adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the docket with theatrical precision. His eyes scanned the page, then lifted to survey the defense table with the curiosity one might reserve for an exotic but ultimately unimpressive zoo exhibit. Case number 24, CR 8847. The People vs. He paused, squinting at the paper. Aaliyah. He drew out the syllables like a child sounding out a difficult word, then chuckled. Monroe. Is the defendant present? Michael Reyes stood quickly. Yes, Your Honor. My client, Aaliyah Monroe, is here. Aaliyah rose, her hands clasped in front of her. Whitmore peered over his glasses at her, his expression shifting from mild confusion to something closer to amusement. Ah. There you are. He leaned back in his chair, rocking slightly. Well, Miss Monroe, did I get that right this time? It appears you've gotten yourself into quite a situation. Misdemeanor assault, trespassing, resisting arrest. Quite the resume for someone your age. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor, a man named Davidson, smirked into his notepad. You know, Whitmore continued, warming to his subject, when I was 17, I was working summers at my father's law firm, learning the value of responsibility. But I suppose different neighborhoods have different priorities. He smiled, the kind of smile that believed itself benevolent. Let's hope this is a learning moment for you, young lady. Lord knows the system isn't kind to repeat offenders. Aaliyah's face remained perfectly still, but something flickered in her eyes, not anger, not fear. Recognition. Michael Reyes cleared his throat. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. We'd like to address. Yes, we'll get to all that, Whitmore interrupted, waving him off like an annoying insect. But first, let's establish some ground rules. This is my courtroom. I've been on this bench for 23 years, and I've seen every trick, every excuse, every sob story you can imagine. So let's save ourselves some time and be honest about what we're dealing with here. He looked directly at Aaliyah, his eyes scanning her borrowed blazer, her canvas bag, her youth. Do you even understand the seriousness of what you're facing? Aaliyah met his gaze without flinching. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. Yes, Your Honor. I understand perfectly. Whitmore chuckled again, a sound that carried no warmth. We'll see about that. Michael Reyes had been a public defender for 11 years, which meant he'd learned to manage expectations the way other people manage their cholesterol, carefully, with full knowledge that things could always get worse. He'd walked into courtroom 4B with a standard plea bargain in mind, knock the assault down to disorderly conduct, time served, probation, and get Aaliyah home before dinner. But 30 seconds into Whitmore's opening remarks, he'd felt that familiar sinking sensation. This judge wasn't interested in justice, he was interested in making an example. Your Honor, Reyes began, standing with practiced deference, if I may, I'd like to discuss a potential resolution that serves everyone's interests. My client is a minor, a first-time offender, and the circumstances of her arrest are. Counselor, Whitmore interrupted, holding up a hand, I've read the police report. Your client was found on private property after being told to leave, then physically resisted when officers attempted to detain her. The circumstances seem fairly straightforward. Reyes forced himself to maintain his professional tone. With respect, Your Honor, the property in question is a community park that's been contested for months. My client was participating in a peaceful neighborhood meeting when a meeting that was trespassing the moment the property owner asked them to disperse, Whitmore countered. But please, continue. He gestured magnanimously, as if granting Reyes permission to dig his own grave. Reyes glanced at his notes, then at the prosecutor, who was leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who knew he'd already won. Standard procedure would be to request a recess, try to negotiate something better in the hallway, maybe file a motion to suppress the arrest report on procedural grounds. But Whitmore wasn't the type to grant motions from public defenders, especially not on a Monday morning. He was about to suggest exactly that recess when he felt a light touch on his sleeve. Aaliyah had leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Reyes, they didn't read the easement provisions. The park's title has a public access clause from 1987. The owner can't legally restrict gatherings between dawn and dusk." Reyes blinked. He turned slightly, keeping his expression neutral, but his eyes searched her face. "What?" Section 4.2 of the County Easement Registry, she continued softly, her eyes still on the judge. The property owner accepted public funding for maintenance in exchange for guaranteed access. The trespassing charge doesn't hold. Reyes felt his pulse quicken. He'd skimmed the police report a dozen times and never thought to check the property records. He pulled his laptop closer, navigating quickly to the county database while Whitmore droned on about courtroom procedure. His fingers moved across the keyboard, searching, finding. There it was. Section 4.2. Public Access Easement. Binding. He stared at the screen, then at Aaliyah, whose expression remained maddeningly calm. "How did you?" he started. She cut him off with the slightest shake of her head. "Not now." Reyes straightened, his exhaustion evaporating like morning fog. "Your Honor, I'd like to file a motion to dismiss the trespassing charge based on a public easement provision that contradicts the property owner's claim." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "The property in question has a legally binding access clause from 1987. My client had every right to be there." For the first time that morning, Judge Harold Whitmore looked genuinely surprised. Whitmore stared at Michael Reyes for a long moment, then let out a short, barking laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "Counselor, are you seriously suggesting that you've discovered some obscure loophole that the arresting officers, the prosecution, and I somehow all missed?" Reyes stood his ground. "It's not a loophole, Your Honor. It's documented public access." "Well then, by all means, enlighten us," Whitmore said, his tone dripping with condescension. He gestured broadly at the courtroom as if inviting everyone to witness this amusing spectacle. Reyes glanced down at his laptop screen, reading carefully. The property located at 1247, Riverside Avenue was granted a county development permit in 1987 under the Parks and Recreation Enhancement Act. In exchange for public funding, the owner agreed to. "Counselor," Whitmore interrupted, "I don't need a history lesson. Do you have an actual legal basis for this motion, or are we wasting the court's time?" "Your Honor, I'm attempting to present." "What you're attempting to do," Whitmore cut in, his patience clearly exhausted, "is delay the inevitable with amateur theatrics. I've seen this strategy 100 times. Throw enough procedural spaghetti at the wall and hope something sticks." He picked up his gavel, tapping it against his palm for emphasis. "Motion denied. The trespassing charge stands. Now, can we proceed with?" "Your Honor." The voice was quiet but it cut through the room like a wire pulled taut. Everyone turned. Aaliyah Monroe was standing. Whitmore's face darkened. "Young lady, your attorney is representing you. Please sit down." "With respect, Your Honor, I'd like to address the court directly," Aaliyah said. Her hands were steady at her sides, her posture straight but not defiant. She looked like someone who had carefully calculated every possible outcome and decided this was the only one worth pursuing. "Absolutely not," Whitmore snapped. "You have counsel. Sit down." Michael Reyes touched her arm gently. "Aaliyah," he whispered, "let me handle this." She didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on Whitmore. Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, Rule 11. A party may address the court with permission. I'm formally requesting that permission, Your Honor. The courtroom went completely silent. Whitmore's jaw tightened. The prosecutor, Davidson, looked up from his notes with sudden interest. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered motionless above her stenotype. "You're 17 years old," Whitmore said slowly, as if explaining something to a particularly slow child. "You are not a lawyer. You do not get to formally request anything in my courtroom beyond a bathroom break." "Rule 11 doesn't specify age or bar membership," Aaliyah replied, her voice still calm. "It grants the right to address procedural concerns. My attorney has presented a valid motion that you've denied without examining the evidence. I'm asking you to review the county records before proceeding with a charge that may be legally baseless." Whitmore's knuckles whitened around his gavel. For a moment, he looked like he might actually throw it. "This is absurd," he finally said, but his voice had lost some of its confident edge. "Mr. Reyes, control your client, or I'll hold her in contempt." "Your Honor," Aaliyah continued, ignoring the threat, "if you deny me the right to address a procedural error, I'll note it for the record and include it in my appeal. Along with your refusal to examine documented evidence. Along with your comments about different neighborhoods having different priorities." The silence that followed was different this time. Heavier. Whitmore stared at her, his face flushing red. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating facts, Your Honor. For the record." The judge opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at the court reporter. She was typing everything. Every word. Every implication. He set his gavel down with exaggerated care. 5 minutes, he said through clenched teeth. "You have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't charge you with contempt and whatever fairy tale your attorney has concocted. If you waste my time, Miss Monroe, you will regret it. Do I make myself clear?" Aaliyah nodded once. "Crystal clear, Your Honor." Aaliyah took a breath, the kind that doesn't show in the shoulders or chest but exists purely in the pause before action. She reached into her canvas tote bag and withdrew a folder, not expensive, just a standard manila folder with papers clipped inside, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. But the way she placed it on the defense table suggested it contained something far more valuable than its appearance suggested. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" Whitmore waved irritably. "Just say what you need to say from there." "Very well." Aaliyah opened the folder, her movements precise and unhurried. The property at 1247, Riverside Avenue was designated as Parcel 14-8C in the 1987 County Development Plan. The owner, Mr. Gerald Hutchinson, applied for a commercial variance to build a private event space. His application was approved on the condition that he maintain public access to the existing green space during daylight hours. She pulled out a photocopied document and held it up. "This is the signed easement agreement. It's filed with the county recorder's office under document number 87 to 4422. The easement runs with the land, meaning it binds all current and future owners, regardless of whether Mr. Hutchinson still owns the property." Davidson, the prosecutor, leaned forward. "Your Honor, this is the first I'm hearing of any easement." "That's because the arresting officers didn't check the property records before filing charges," Aaliyah replied, her tone clinical, absent of accusation. "They relied on Mr. Hutchinson's complaint without verifying his legal standing to exclude the public." Whitmore's fingers drummed against the bench. "Even if, and I stress if, this easement exists, your client was arrested for assault and resisting arrest, not merely trespassing. The other charges stand. They don't, Your Honor. Aaliyah set down the first document and picked up another. The assault charge stems from a statement by Officer Bradley Watkins, who claims I shoved him when he attempted to detain me. However, Officer Watkins failed to establish probable cause before initiating the detention. He had a complaint from the property owner. Davidson interjected. That's sufficient. Aaliyah turned to look at him for the first time, and something in her gaze made him stop talking. A complaint alone doesn't establish probable cause if the underlying claim is false. If I had a legal right to be on that property, which I did, then Officer Watkins had no authority to detain me. His attempt to do so was unlawful. My response was self-defense. The courtroom had become utterly still. Even the usual shuffle of papers, the quiet coughs, the shifting in seats, everything had stopped. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype, the soft clicking the only sound in the room. Whitmore leaned forward. You're telling me you defended yourself against a police officer? I stepped backward to avoid unlawful physical contact, Aaliyah corrected. Officer Watkins interpreted that as aggression and escalated. His body camera footage, which I assume the prosecution has provided, will show that I never initiated physical contact. I repeatedly stated that I was on public property and asked him to verify the easement before detaining me. He refused. Davidson flipped through his file frantically. Your Honor, the body camera footage it's inconclusive. It shows exactly what I just described, Aaliyah said. And if it doesn't, then I'd like to know why the prosecution is withholding exculpatory evidence. Whitmore's face had gone from red to pale. Miss Monroe, are you accusing this court of misconduct? No, Your Honor. I'm identifying procedural errors that compromise the integrity of the charges against me. If those errors are corrected, I believe you'll find that none of the charges have merit. She said it without triumph, without smugness. She said it the way a surgeon might describe a necessary incision, regrettable, but required. The judge stared at her, and for the first time since taking the bench that morning, he seemed genuinely uncertain about what to do next. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his robe pocket, a practiced gesture that bought him time to think. When he replaced them, his expression had hardened into something more dangerous than mockery, wounded pride. Miss Monroe, he began, his voice cold and controlled, I appreciate your enthusiasm for the law. But let me clarify something for you, since you seem to have learned just enough to be dangerous. He picked up a bound volume from beside his bench, letting it drop with a heavy thud. California Penal Code, Section 148. It is illegal to willfully resist, delay, or obstruct any peace officer in the discharge of their duties. Your interpretation of self-defense is creative, but it's also wrong. Aaliyah didn't react. She simply waited, hands folded, as if she'd expected this exact response. Whitmore continued, gaining confidence. The law doesn't require an officer to verify every property claim before making an arrest. That's not how policing works, and frankly, it's not how reality works. Officer Watkins had a complaint, he had a subject refusing to leave, and he had legal authority to detain that subject pending investigation. Your so-called public easement is irrelevant to the conduct charge. Actually, Your Honor, it's not. Whitmore's eyes flashed. Excuse me. Section 148 requires the officer to be engaged in the lawful performance of their duties, Aaliyah said. If the detention itself was unlawful, which it was, given my legal right to be present, then I cannot be guilty of obstructing an unlawful action. The California Supreme Court clarified this in People v. Gonzalez, which held that. I know what Gonzalez held, Whitmore interrupted sharply. I've been citing that case since before you were born. Then you know it was partially overturned. The courtroom seemed to inhale collectively. Whitmore's face froze. What? Gonzalez was narrowed by People v. White in 2024, Aaliyah continued, her voice steady. The court held that defendants have a cognizable right to resist detention when the officer lacks both a warrant and probable cause. Since Officer Watkins had neither, and since I was on public property, his attempt to detain me fell outside the protection of Section 148. She paused, then added quietly, the decision was issued 7 months ago. It's been cited in at least 15 appellate opinions since then. Whitmore stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Davidson shuffled frantically through papers on his table. Michael Reyes, despite years of maintaining professional composure, couldn't stop the small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's... Whitmore started, then stopped. He turned to Davidson. Is this accurate? Davidson looked up, his face pale. I'd need to verify, Your Honor. It's accurate, Aaliyah said. She reached into her folder and pulled out a stapled document, walking it to the bailiff. This is the full opinion from People v. White, with the relevant section highlighted. The court specifically addressed scenarios where defendants are on property they believe they have a right to occupy. The bailiff delivered the papers to Whitmore, who scanned them with increasing agitation. His finger traced down the page, his lips moving slightly as he read. When he looked up, his expression had transformed from confident authority to something closer to panic. This isn't. He set the papers down, his hand trembling slightly. This is a very narrow reading of a complex ruling. It's the holding of the case, Your Honor, Aaliyah replied. And it's directly on point. Whitmore's jaw worked soundlessly. He'd built a career on being the smartest person in the room, on knowing the law better than the overworked public defenders and young prosecutors who cycled through his courtroom. But now he was sitting on his elevated bench, robed in authority, looking down at a 17-year-old girl who had just corrected him on binding precedent. And everyone in the courtroom had watched it happen. We'll take a 15-minute recess, he finally managed, his voice hoarse. Counsel, both of you, my chambers. Now. He stood abruptly, his robe billowing as he disappeared through the door behind the bench. Aaliyah returned to the defense table and sat down calmly, her hands folded in her lap. Michael Reyes leaned close. Who the hell are you? He whispered. She allowed herself the smallest smile. Someone who reads case law, Mr. Reyes. You should try it sometime. The recess lasted 30 minutes, not 15. When Whitmore finally returned to the bench, he moved with the careful precision of someone trying to reassemble their dignity from scattered pieces. His face was composed, but a thin sheen of perspiration caught the fluorescent light. Davidson, the prosecutor, followed behind him with the grim expression of a man who'd just been thoroughly dressed down in private. We're back on the record, Whitmore said, his voice tight. After reviewing the materials presented by the defense, the court is prepared to reconsider certain aspects of the charges. Aaliyah remained perfectly still, but Michael Reyes could feel the shift in the room's energy. The gallery, which had been half empty and disinterested at the start of proceedings, was now fully attentive. Word had spread during the recess, something unusual was happening in courtroom 4B. However, Whitmore continued, raising a finger, before we proceed, I want to make something absolutely clear. This court does not appreciate theatrics, and it does not appreciate being blindsided with last-minute legal theories, no matter how technically sound they may be. He fixed Aaliyah with a hard stare. You got lucky today, Miss Monroe. You found a case that happens to apply to your situation. But don't mistake that for actual legal expertise. Real attorneys spend years developing the judgment and experience necessary to practice law. Your Honor, Aaliyah said quietly, may I respond? Whitmore's jaw clenched. No, you may not. I'm speaking. Then I'd like what you're saying noted for the record, Aaliyah replied. Because what you're describing as luck is actually preparation. And what you're calling theatrics is a defendant exercising her constitutional right to challenge wrongful charges. The judge's knuckles whitened on his gavel. Miss Monroe. I'm not finished, Your Honor. Aaliyah's voice remained calm, but something in her tone had changed. It was no longer deferential. It was surgical. You said this court doesn't appreciate being blindsided, but you were only blindsided because you didn't review the relevant case law before rushing to judgment. You saw a 17-year-old black girl from the wrong zip code and assumed guilt. You made a joke about my future before you'd even heard the facts. That's enough, Whitmore snapped. Is it? Aaliyah opened her folder again, pulling out a new document. Because I've also pulled your sentencing records for the past 3 years. Public information, available through the court's own database. Would you like to know what they show? The courtroom went dead silent. Davidson half rose from his chair. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. Sit down, Counselor, Aaliyah said without looking at him. Her eyes stayed locked on Whitmore. In the past 3 years, Your Honor has presided over 47 cases involving defendants aged 15 to 20. Of those, 32 involved defendants of color. Of those 32, you issued the maximum allowable sentence in 28 cases. That's an 87% rate. She laid the document on the table. For white defendants in the same age range and with comparable charges, your maximum sentencing rate was 32%. That's a 55-point differential. Whitmore's face had gone from pale to gray. Those numbers are meaningless without context. Different cases have different circumstances. I controlled for offense severity, prior record, and plea agreement status, Aaliyah interrupted. The disparity holds across every category. The only variable that consistently predicts maximum sentencing in your courtroom is the defendant's race. Michael Reyes put a hand on her shoulder, but she gently shook it off. You asked if I understood what I was facing, she continued. I did. I was facing a judge who statistically sentences people who look like me to the harshest possible penalties, regardless of the facts. I was facing a system that would have convicted me of trespassing on public property, assault for avoiding an unlawful detention, and resistance for exercising my constitutional rights. And I was facing all of that because you looked at me and saw what you expected to see, rather than what was actually there. She picked up the sentencing analysis and held it out toward the bench. This isn't theatrics, Your Honor. This is evidence. And unlike the evidence used to arrest me, mine is accurate. For a long moment, no one moved. Whitmore stared at the document in her hand as if it were a live grenade. Then, from the back of the courtroom, came the sound of a door opening. The man who entered courtroom 4B moved with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to announce himself, his presence did it for him. He was in his mid-60s, black, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the air of a scholar who'd walked out of a history book. Several people in the gallery straightened immediately, whispering to each other. Aaliyah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, recognition. Judge Whitmore noticed the disturbance and looked toward the back of the courtroom. When he saw who had entered, his face went through several rapid transformations, confusion, recognition, and finally, dawning horror. Chief Justice Sterling, Whitmore said, his voice strangled. I wasn't aware you were observing today. Chief Justice Theodore Sterling, recently retired from the state Supreme Court and now Dean of the State Bar, walked slowly down the center aisle. The court reporter's fingers trembled over her stenotype. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. "That was intentional, Judge Whitmore," Sterling said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of decades on the bench. "I've found that unannounced observations tend to reveal the truest character of a courtroom." He stopped at the rail separating the gallery from the well of the court, resting his hands on the polished wood. His eyes moved from Whitmore to Aaliyah, and something passed between them, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "I've been sitting in the back for the past 40 minutes, Sterling continued. "Long enough to hear a teenage defendant demonstrate a more thorough understanding of criminal procedure than some attorneys I've supervised. Long enough to watch her dismantle a wrongful prosecution with nothing but court records and case law. And long enough to hear a sitting judge defend sentencing disparities that, frankly, should have triggered a judicial review years ago." Whitmore opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sterling turned to Aaliyah. "Miss Monroe, would you approach, please?" Aaliyah stood and walked to the rail. Up close, Sterling's eyes were kind but penetrating, the eyes of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating character. "Tell me," he said quietly, "how long have you been studying law?" "Since I was 12, Justice Sterling," Aaliyah replied. "My mother's a paralegal. I used to read her case files after school." "And the externship with Morrison and Wells?" "2 summers. They don't usually take high school students, but I filed a 20-page research memo on qualified immunity doctrine that the senior partners used in oral arguments. They made an exception." Sterling nodded slowly, then turned back to the courtroom. "Judge Whitmore, members of the court, I should have introduced Miss Monroe properly from the beginning. Aaliyah Monroe is not merely a defendant. She is this year's recipient of the Thurgood Marshall Fellowship, the youngest in the program's history. The charges against her were a simulation designed to test her ability to defend herself against institutional bias in real time." The courtroom erupted. Whispers became exclamations. Davidson dropped his pen. Michael Reyes let out a breath that sounded like a laugh and a sob combined. Whitmore remained frozen, his face ashen. "This was a test," he finally whispered. "It was," Sterling confirmed. "For her, it was the final component of her fellowship evaluation. She needed to demonstrate that she could identify and challenge systemic injustice even when facing significant power imbalances." He paused, his expression hardening. "For you, Judge Whitmore, it was also a test. One that you failed spectacularly." Sterling reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "The State Bar Commission has been reviewing complaints about your courtroom for 18 months. We needed to see if the patterns in your sentencing were truly discriminatory or if they could be explained by other factors. Miss Monroe's experience has provided us with definitive evidence." He set the envelope on the prosecutor's table. "That contains a formal notice of investigation. You'll be expected to respond to the commission within 30 days. Your docket will be reassigned pending the outcome." Whitmore stared at the envelope as if it were a death sentence. Sterling turned back to Aaliyah, and this time he did smile. "As for you, Miss Monroe, congratulations. You've passed with distinction. The Fellowship Board will convene next week to formalize your admission to the accelerated law program at State." Aaliyah's composure finally cracked. Her eyes welled, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. "You did it," Sterling said quietly. "You proved what we already knew, that brilliance has nothing to do with what someone expects to see, and everything to do with what you're capable of becoming." The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence as Chief Justice Sterling's words settled over them like ash after an explosion. Judge Whitmore sat motionless on his bench, still staring at the envelope that contained the formal notice of investigation. His hands, which had wielded the gavel with such casual authority less than an hour ago, now gripped the armrests of his chair as if the room were tilting beneath him. Your Honor, the bailiff said quietly, do you want to, should we adjourn? Whitmore didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved slowly across the courtroom, the gallery filled with observers who'd witnessed his humiliation, the court reporter whose transcript would document every moment of his failure, the prosecutor who'd been complicit in charges that never should have been filed, and finally, Aaliyah Monroe, standing beside Chief Justice Sterling with tears streaming down her face. 23 years, Whitmore said finally, his voice hollow. I've been on this bench for 23 years. And in that time, Sterling replied, his tone neither cruel nor sympathetic, simply factual, you've made thousands of decisions that shaped people's lives. Some of those decisions were just. But far too many were tainted by assumptions you refused to examine. Today, you had an opportunity to see past your biases. You chose not to take it. Whitmore's hands trembled. I never intended to discriminate. I thought I was being fair. I thought I was treating everyone according to the law. Intent isn't a defense, Aaliyah said quietly, wiping her eyes. And treating everyone the same isn't justice when you start with different assumptions about who they are. Whitmore looked at her directly for the first time since Sterling's revelation. Really looked at her, not as a defendant, not as a statistic, but as a person who had outmaneuvered him at every turn using nothing but the law he claimed to serve. How did you know? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. How did you know what I'd do? What I'd say? Aaliyah met his gaze with something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't triumph either. Because I read your cases, Your Honor. All of them. I read the transcripts of your proceedings. I studied the pattern of your decisions. You weren't hard to predict, you've been making the same assumptions for years. You just never had someone in front of you who knew how to prove it. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Sterling picked up his briefcase from where he'd set it on the rail. Judge Whitmore, the commission will contact you formally within 72 hours. I'd suggest you retain counsel. As for this proceeding, he gestured to the courtroom at large. It's concluded. Miss Monroe is, obviously, free to go. The charges against her were simulated and will not appear on any record. Michael Reyes, who had been silent throughout the revelation, finally found his voice. Justice Sterling, I had no idea. When I was assigned this case, I thought. You thought it was a standard public defender assignment, Sterling finished. That was intentional. We needed to see how the system would treat Miss Monroe with no special accommodations, no one vouching for her potential. You did well, Mr. Reyes. You listened to your client and adapted when presented with new information. That's more than can be said for others in this room. Reyes looked at Aaliyah with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. You played me. I needed you to be genuine, she said apologetically. If you'd known it was a test, you would have behaved differently. I'm sorry. Don't be. Reyes shook his head, a rueful smile crossing his face. You just taught me more about legal strategy in 1 hour than I learned in 3 years of law school. Davidson, the prosecutor, had gathered his files and was trying to slip toward the exit. Sterling's voice stopped him cold. Mr. Davidson, a word. The prosecutor froze, his shoulders sagging. The commission will also want to speak with you about your office's charging practices. Particularly your failure to verify the property records before filing trespassing charges, and your decision to move forward with an assault charge despite body camera footage that contradicted the arresting officer's account. Davidson turned slowly, his face pale. Sir, I was just following standard procedure. Standard procedure is exactly the problem, Sterling said quietly. And it ends today. He turned back to Whitmore, who still hadn't moved from his chair. The judge seemed smaller somehow, diminished, as if the robe that had granted him authority now only highlighted how fragile that authority had always been. "I built my career on being fair," Whitmore said softly, almost to himself. "I thought I was one of the good ones." "The good ones question themselves," Aaliyah said. "They don't assume they're right just because they've been doing something for a long time." Whitmore looked at her, and for the first time, there was no condescension in his expression. Only exhaustion. "What happens now?" Sterling closed his briefcase with a decisive click. "Now, Judge Whitmore, you face the consequences of your decisions. Just like everyone who's ever stood before your bench had to face theirs. The difference is, you'll have resources, attorneys, and due process protections. You'll be treated with the fairness you should have been extending to others all along." He walked toward the exit, then paused at the door. "I hope you learn from this. I genuinely do. Because the law is supposed to be a shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the comfortable. And judges who forget that don't deserve the bench." The door closed behind him with a quiet finality. Aaliyah gathered her canvas bag, slipping the folders back inside. Michael Reyes stood beside her, still processing everything that had happened. "What happens to you now?" he asked. She smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile she'd allowed herself all day. "Now I go home and tell my mother that I passed. Then I start preparing for law school. And after that..." She glanced back at Whitmore, still frozen on his bench. "After that, I make sure there are fewer judges like him, and more courtrooms where people like me don't have to fight this hard just to be heard." Reyes extended his hand. "When you pass the bar, call me. I want to be the first person to hire you." Aaliyah shook it firmly. "You might not be able to afford me by then." "Probably not," he admitted with a laugh. "But I'll try anyway." As they walked toward the exit, the gallery slowly began to empty. The court reporter closed her stenotype, her expression thoughtful. The bailiff stood at attention, watching Judge Whitmore with concern. And Harold Whitmore sat alone on his elevated bench, surrounded by the symbols of authority he'd wielded for 23 years, finally understanding what it felt like to be judged. The late afternoon sun cut through the tall windows of the Superior Court building, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Aaliyah pushed through the brass-handled doors, the same doors she'd entered hours earlier, and stepped out into air that tasted like freedom and vindication and the particular sweetness of a battle won against impossible odds. Her mother was waiting on the courthouse steps, still in her paralegal's blazer, her eyes red from crying. When she saw Aaliyah, she rushed forward and pulled her daughter into a fierce hug that lasted long enough for both of them to remember how frightened they'd been, how uncertain, how close it had all come to going differently. "You did it," her mother whispered into her braids. "Baby, you did it." "We did it," Aaliyah corrected, pulling back to look at her mother's face. "Every case file you brought home, every legal term you explained, every time you let me sit in on your prep work, it all mattered, Mom. I couldn't have done this without you." Her mother cupped her face with both hands. "You brilliant, terrifying, wonderful girl. Do you have any idea how proud I am?" Aaliyah laughed, the sound breaking free like something that had been locked away for hours. "I have some idea." Behind her, the courthouse doors opened again, and Michael Reyes emerged, his messenger bag slung over one shoulder. He spotted them and waved. "Ms. Monroe. I wanted to say goodbye before you left." Aaliyah's mother turned, her professional demeanor snapping into place. "Mr. Reyes. Thank you for representing my daughter. I know this wasn't what you expected." "That's an understatement," Reyes admitted. He looked at Aaliyah. "I meant what I said in there. When you're ready to practice, you call me. I'd be honored to work with you." "I will," Aaliyah promised. But fair warning, I'm going to specialize in criminal justice reform. Specifically, judicial bias and prosecutorial misconduct. Reyes grinned. I'd expect nothing less. He headed down the steps, pausing once to look back. For what it's worth. What you did in there wasn't just impressive. It was necessary. This system needs people like you. People who won't let it hide behind procedure and precedent when those things are being used to perpetuate injustice. After he left, Aaliyah and her mother stood together on the courthouse steps, watching the city move around them, people heading home from work, buses pulling up to stops, the ordinary machinery of life continuing as if the world hadn't just shifted slightly on its axis. "What are you thinking about?" her mother asked. "Judge Whitmore," Aaliyah admitted. "I keep thinking about his face when Chief Justice Sterling handed him that envelope. He looked broken." "Good. Maybe." Aaliyah frowned. "But also. I don't know. I didn't do this to destroy him. I did it to prove that the system can be challenged. That it has to be challenged. I wanted to show that a 17-year-old girl with a canvas bag and a folder of case law can stand up to institutional power and win. Because if I can do it, then maybe others will feel like they can too." Her mother squeezed her hand. "You did show that, baby. And you'll keep showing it. That's who you are." They started down the steps together. At the bottom, Aaliyah paused and looked back at the courthouse, at the imposing columns, the carved inscriptions about justice and equality, the massive doors designed to intimidate anyone who approached them. "I'll be back here someday," she said quietly. "But next time, I won't be the defendant. I'll be the one making sure defendants get the representation they deserve." "I believe you," her mother said. "The whole world will believe you soon enough." Inside courtroom 4B, Judge Harold Whitmore sat alone at his bench. The gallery was empty now, the lights dimmed, the usual bustle of the justice system moved on to other rooms, other cases, other lives to impact. He still held the envelope in his hands, though he hadn't yet opened it. He knew what it contained. He'd known, on some level, for years. The door to his chambers stood open behind him. Beyond it waited his office, the photographs of his swearing-in ceremony, the diplomas from prestigious schools, the commendations from bar associations, all the accumulated proof of a career built on the assumption that good intentions were enough. That treating everyone fairly according to his own understanding of fairness was the same as actual justice. Aaliyah Monroe had proven otherwise. He set the envelope on the bench and stood slowly, his joints aching in a way they hadn't that morning. The robe felt heavier now, weighted with all the decisions he couldn't take back, all the lives he'd shaped without ever truly seeing the people standing before him. As he walked toward his chambers for what might be the last time as a sitting judge, he thought about the girl with the canvas bag who had memorized case law, who had studied his patterns, who had walked into his courtroom knowing exactly what he would do and how she would respond. She'd been prepared for him in ways he'd never been prepared for her. He'd called her lucky. He'd been wrong about that too. Outside, Aaliyah Monroe walked away from the Superior Court building with her mother beside her, heading toward a future she'd fought for, earned, and ultimately proven she deserved. The courthouse remained behind her, solid and imposing as ever. But its power over her was gone. And she was just beginning. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next